Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and this is Talk.pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. My guest today is Jenn Trepeck, host of the Salad with a Side of Fries podcast. Jenn is also a health coach, a business consultant who has leveraged her business education to grow her podcast into a top 1.5% podcast with multiple awards to its credit. Jenn, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Of course. So I want to kick off maybe just for anyone that's not heard about your podcast before, give us a quick summary of what the show's about.
Sure. We call it Wellness Without the Weirdness. It is health and nutrition, lifestyle choices to create a healthful life, but for real life. You know, the show description talks about like skipping the grocery store and eating out and, you know, all the things that help us enjoy life. It's not just, you know, only eat foods that are green kind of a thing.
Right. Yeah. And I'm curious about how you came up with the name because it's a great name. I love it. But also feels like the name itself signals that there's some level of permission that you're giving to the listeners before they've even heard the show. Was that intentional, kind of an intentional philosophy that you baked into the name of the podcast right from the beginning?
Yes and no, because so the name came from the fact that it's most of the time my default meal. You know, like I eat that all the time. And so it felt fitting for the name of the show. And it was intentional that it really helped people understand kind of my philosophy from the jump. You know, that this isn't, you know, vegetables for all the time, you know. And so it was intentional in wanting to communicate what the show is about from the name of the show. At the same time, it was really just what I typically order. And over time, it has really become almost like a beacon for people to identify with the show or not. And so it's kind of like every now and then some people will say to me like, I don't get it. And I'm like, that's okay. The show is probably enough for you, you know? Like, you know.
So from what I've seen, the show comes kind of in two formats, or at least the episodes do. There's the kind of full length, roughly 50-minute deep dives. You often have guests on. Then you also have these shorter nutrition nuggets, which I guess are kind of bite-sized episodes. And I really like that sort of content architecture. I've seen other podcasters use it before. But I'm wondering what sort of drove the decision behind structuring it that way. And is it to sort of serve different audiences, different types of listeners?
Sure. So admittedly, in the very beginning, so the Nutrition Nuggets launched, let's see, the show launched August of 2019. The Nutrition Nuggets came to be in March of 2020. And it was a strategic choice for two reasons. One was to increase downloads. Mm-hmm. And two was to create more entry points. That a new listener is more likely to give you 10, 15 minutes than 45 or 50.
Right.
And it created a window into my approach and what I talk about and the things that we look at. And so if those were interesting to you, then check out the full-length episodes. And in the full-length episodes, you mentioned some are interviews. So it's roughly every other.
Okay.
Alternating interviews and then episodes that I call like my content or things that I talk about with my clients or topics that I want to address or cover. And on those episodes, I still have someone join me so that it's not just me talking for however long.
Right.
And so that person is sometimes a listener. Sometimes it's a friend. Sometimes my mom has joined me. Sometimes it's clients. And so on those episodes, it allows that other person to be the voice of the listener, to say, okay, well, you're saying this and that makes me think of something else. So how does that fit into this? Or wait a minute, what you said doesn't make sense. Say that one more time. So it helps create and continue a dialogue, and took for me, when I first started the show, one of the things that I really wanted to do was take pieces that I enjoyed from podcasts I listened to and put it into the wellness category, or the nutrition and health and wellness category of podcasts that I didn't really see as much of when I, was researching and kind of figuring out what my show was going to look like.
Interesting. I think when I was doing some research on your show, I saw you say somewhere that the wellness industry is off the rails.
Yes.
And obviously, like you mentioned, your tagline for the show is wellness without the weirdness. Can you maybe comment on whether that's ever sort of created any friction with guests or potential sponsors for the show?
So it's funny. Friction for them, maybe. But for me, it becomes the guiding principle. It is the measuring stick by which I can say, this person is a fit, this person is not a fit.
Right.
And, actually, so when guests are pitched to me, I do a pre-podcast discovery call. And I do this for a couple reasons. One is, as you can imagine, I end up with a lot of people who all want to talk about the exact same things. So
sure,
I want to make sure that we can make it an aligned conversation, but also slightly different. Keeping it interesting for them and the audience, and for me too. And also, like I said, that we're aligned, that we're going to give the listener something super tangible that they can do after listening.
Right.
Where it doesn't feel like, when I say without the weirdness, or that the wellness industry has gone off the rails, like if your recommendation requires $1 billion budget, not the place for it. If your only answer to helping someone is you, I don't think this is the place either. So it becomes this guiding principle to say, what am I bringing to people? Why are people showing up? Can I deliver on that?
Yeah.
And part of that stems from how I work in my coaching practice as well, and what I do with my clients. And so it really, there's sometimes some friction because I won't take ads or sponsorships, or, with a lot of brands that I wouldn't recommend in my practice, or that I don't work with in my practice. And sometimes there are really big names that I could have on the show, and yet I'm going to say no because their objective is different.
Yeah. I admire that too, because you touched on briefly on the topic there of sort of, budget. There's a lot of sort of wellness influencers, I feel like.
Yeah.
Sure, I'd like to follow your protocol, but I don't exactly have an extra, $1,000 a month to spend on this stuff, or whatever it is, right? So, yeah, that's an interesting point there. And just
think,
on the topic
go ahead.
Yeah, no,
I was going to
please.
say, I think it's part of what has gone off the rails. In that there's and I say this with love and compassion, but I think there's the tech bro.
Oh, yeah.
Want to live forever, that requires a level of commitment that's completely unreasonable for the average person. And so they're talking to somebody with potentially unlimited funds or unlimited time, and where this optimization thing is their top priority. I live in a world where I want to be healthful. I want to live a long life with vitality and energy and the dignity of choice to do all of the things that I want to do. And that includes other commitments and other priorities. So I sometimes talk about it as like, you can make your health a priority without it becoming your entire personality. And I think that's part of what we're seeing in the going off the rails.
So just going further down that road of talking about sort of misinformation and disinformation in this space, are there any sort of particularly egregious podcasts that you've come across that are, I don't know, particularly bad actors in this sense? Or I mean, you don't have to point out anybody, but you commented there a bit on that sort of tech bro sphere.
Yeah.
Maybe you can give a bit more color there.
I think, and not to name names, I think most of the time, it's not that something is completely misinformation. It's that it's missing the nuance. So things are talked about in a way that makes it sound like either this is the answer for everyone and or you're the problem if this doesn't work for you.
Right.
And I think, and it's been interesting because there's a lot of these men who I'm seeing really in the last 9 months to a year really starting to change how they're talking about things and recognizing that the person listening to them is not them.
Why do you think that's changing?
I think there's two things. I think a lot of them have gotten involved with government in regards to health. And therein lies the difference between public health and personal health.
Right.
So a lot of things that work or are the approach for personal health are not necessarily the public health guidelines or recommendations. And how do we balance that? And how do we explain that? So I think they're starting to realize some of that. I think there's also a complete economic piece to it that, you can make a fortune serving a select group of people.
Sure.
And there's billions in the space of serving the masses.
Right.
So I think it's all of the above. But I think, most of the time what I'm seeing and what frustrates me is nuance in what they're sharing so that somebody can then evaluate, is this the approach for me or not? Or a piece where the language around it exacerbates all of the same issues. Their approach is, we'll just do it. And I speak more to the person who says, okay, easier said than done. Like, if it was that simple, we'd all flip the switch and be done with this, and we wouldn't need to keep talking about it. So sometimes those are the things that frustrate me in the space. And I mean, we'll see as things, continue to evolve what happens. But
I'm curious about the demographic makeup of your audience. Do you know sort of roughly how it sits, like male versus female?
Yeah, we're much more female than male. It's about, I want to say, it's like 85% female, which is a lot. The more interesting thing is that over 50% of the listenership is like 40 to 70.
Wow.
And so part of that is directly, and now I've been doing this work for almost 20 years. So I started in my 20s. And even then, my clients were always in that same age demographic because I come at this from the perspective of health rather than aesthetics. And so I think that's part of why the listenership skews, I think, older for what some might expect for a podcast. But given how I approach things, that's exactly what I expected.
Yeah, that surprises me a bit as well, for sure.
Yeah.
So you're at over 600 episodes now, I believe, which is quite a lot. Not a lot of podcasts that get there. During that time that you've been doing the show, is there a nutrition myth that you feel like maybe has been the most challenging to kind of dislodge from people's minds as you talk to them?
Calories.
Really?
Yeah. It's, I deep sigh as we have this, the old approach of calories in, calories out. And again, because so many influencers and fitness people still come at it from that perspective, it is hands down the hardest for people to let go of mentally. And, it is what it is. It's part of my job, to help people reframe all of that and understand that fundamentally it's just not how the body works. But it's that
So
old calories in, calories out. Yeah.
So for a knucklehead like me, just give me like a very quick explanation of why calories in, calories out does not work.
So it's just not how the body works because not all calories are the same. And you know that because if you have kids or if you knew a kid, you wouldn't recommend that they eat Skittles all day. And as long as they stay under 2,000 calories, they're fine.
I don't know. My daughter would be pretty happy, I think.
Right. But we, as a parent, we wouldn't recommend that. So fundamentally, we know that calories aren't the same.
Yeah.
The reason why I think it's been propagated for so long is because kind of physics would say, of course, that's how it works, right? More output than input, you end up with a net negative and things change. Right. The reality is, and the best explanation I heard is that is the case for a closed loop system.
Okay.
The human body is not a closed loop system. Mm-hmm. So in theory, that makes sense. In reality, it doesn't apply here because there are so many other variables. So what matters is not the number of calories, but the quality of those calories. Because our body is going to do something different with carrots than it is with a Twix.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Not that hard after all.
Right.
Listening to your show, I noticed that you dedicated some episodes to sort of that emotional relationship that we have with food. Things like guilt, competition, fear, sort of mental bandwidth. What's a question that you wish more of your listeners would ask themselves before they start, another diet, another trend, something they heard on another podcast?
I love this question. The question to ask yourself is, do I care how long the results last? Because if we don't care how long they last, you can literally do anything. You can do the calories in, calories out thing. You can do the cabbage soup diet. You can fast. You could do a million things. Frankly, anything you do will, quote unquote, work to make the scale go down for a finite period of time or to change the blood work for a finite period of time. But if we want it to last, it probably requires us to consider how we're going about making those changes.
Right. Yeah. What's, while I have you here and you're clearly an expert on these topics, what is your view on intermittent fasting?
I like it better for men than for women. I also think it depends what your feeding and fasting windows look like. Mm-hmm. But I come back, wellness without the weirdness. Let's just come back to common sense. If the average person, given 24 hours a day to eat, does not get their body all of the nutrients that it needs to function well and not create disease, how do we think that's going to happen in shorter and shorter and shorter windows?
Interesting.
So, certain kinds of fasting for a finite period of time can have some cellular regenerative, and cellular health benefits. The kind of fasting that I'm a really big fan of for everybody is 2 to 3 hours before bed to about an hour to 90 minutes after waking up.
Okay.
For the women in the perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, that window before bed might be better at 4 hours. But we want our fasting window to be before bed, including the time we sleep. And then within about an hour to 90 minutes of waking up, we need to fuel again.
Okay, so I want to switch gears here for a moment and start talking about what you've done to promote your podcast. When you first hit publish at the very beginning, maybe walk me through what sort of your initial growth strategy was, and maybe if you had to boil it down to kind of 2 or 3 things that you did that kind of kicked things off for you.
Yeah, so first, around the launch, similar to actually what I did when my book launched last year, is I created almost like a unofficial launch team. And I had made a list for myself of friends and family, and I personally sent a text message with the link to Apple Podcasts and said, my podcast launch, like I gave them a heads up, and then my podcast launch, here's the link. Please click the link and tap, which at the time I think was subscribe. Now it's follow, and I sent them the link. And I hand sent those text messages to people. And that was really around sort of the very beginning in the launch. I used social media as well, but I didn't start with a separate social account for the show.
Okay.
I just started adding it to my personal, and I became more consistent in posting on my personal accounts than I was before. So then the podcast became a piece of the things that I talked about versus everything.
Mm-hmm.
And from the very beginning, podcast guesting has been my go-to growth strategy. Because I know we've all had these conversations, people listen to, generally, statistically, people listen to more than one podcast. So it's easier to convert a listener who's already a podcast listener to add another one to their rotation than it is to find someone who's not a podcast listener and try to convince them that this is the thing for them to do and spend their time on.
Mm-hmm.
And that even goes back to business principles of the same thing.
Of course.
It's easier to sell an additional product to an existing customer than to go out and find a new one.
Yeah, so pulling on that thread a little bit more, this doesn't surprise me. A bunch of the podcasters I've spoken to so far have said the same thing. Guesting on other shows is sort of near their top of the list as well. But I'm curious how you can achieve that. How does the average podcaster, how do they wind up guesting on other shows? What steps do you go through to make sure that happens? Now, obviously, your podcast is of a particular size. You've been doing this for a while, so you're fairly well known. But when you were just getting going and you were looking to be a guest, what did you do?
Yeah. So, and I still do the exact same thing now that I did then. And it's pitching consistently new shows every week and following up with them. The piece that I find to be the difference maker, because I also receive a lot of pitches, and I receive a lot of pitches from, and I don't pay a company to do this for me. I have my own team that does this, and I work with them, and they follow sort of, my approach. And I can't even tell you how many pitches I receive that are terrible that people have paid for. And sometimes I want to reach out and be like, seriously? But some of the things that
not talk,
yeah,
not talk.pod. Obviously, this podcast just getting going.
No, obviously.
I've been running the Find.pod newsletter for 6 years, and I get like hundreds of pitches every week, and the vast majority are not very good.
Yes. So demonstrating, that pitch must be personal to that show. Demonstrate that you understand what that show talks about, who that host is, the kinds of things that they would want to share, and who their audience is. And then, what is your unique perspective, your added value? How are you adding to that conversation? I have a lot where they pitch me exactly what I talk about. There's nothing interesting. There's nothing unique about it. There's nothing there that says, oh, I'd like to learn more about what they might say.
Right.
Or they send me something where I get somewhere it's like completely not about or a fit for what I talk about.
Yeah, that's annoying.
And you can tell that it's been copy pasted. The other thing is when you're sending that pitch, give it a name of a suggestion that they could use as the title of the episode or not, but it's giving a catchy title to the topic. And in the way you describe it, if they're savvy, you've given them all the questions to ask you. Now, a lot of them will still ask you to write your own questions, which is one of my pet peeves. But the pitch needs to give them enough that they totally get what that conversation might look like. Now, I still do a discovery call because I want to go a little deeper, maybe take a different angle or, whatever that might be. But when I'm sending them out, those are the things I think that make the biggest difference. And the other thing that I see in terms of pitching, especially when I'm working with another podcast to help them with growth strategy or some of those kinds of things, we can get really siloed into the kinds of podcasts that we would want to be a guest on. And I think that we want to expand to say, wait a minute, like for me, people who listen to dating podcasts are totally an overlap with not just who I am, but with my audience. People who listen to personal story podcasts or, women business owner podcasts, like those also overlap with people who would be interested, like their listeners are potentially my listeners also, that they're interested in these things too. And so I think we want to choose from that perspective who we pitch rather than always choosing from a genre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good advice. You've talked on other shows also about turning salad with a side of fries into a brand, that's something that actually feeds your business. Not just a content hobby, essentially. I'm wondering what key decisions sort of turned the podcast into a real engine for, getting clients, getting speaking engagements, book sales, rather than just sort of a free education for anybody that winds up tuning in.
I think it was always part of the plan and the strategy behind the show. I built my health coaching practice on the side of a full-time job. I launched the podcast when I left my full-time job. So the idea from the beginning was that it could potentially feed my health coaching practice, So it was always part of the strategy. What ended up happening over time was additional streams of income, that people really resonated with, like you said at the beginning, this name salad with a side of fries. So, a couple of years ago, I launched some merch and it was like, great, let's see, here are some things. And again, always keeping it very strategic. Like, what are the things that make sense? So there's notebooks, there's kitchen magnets, there's a glass cutting board, there's a lunchbox, there's workout gear. So the idea is all things that are aligned and branded. I added a membership for the podcast January of 2020. So like I said, the show started August 2019. January 2020, I started the membership. Probably early for when most shows...
A little bit, yeah.
Would launch a membership.
Mm-hmm.
The reason was admittedly a little bit of a test to see, can I leverage this community into something more? And it gave a midpoint. So in my business offering, you have the podcast that's sort of this top of funnel free content. And then, I work with supplements and people could buy products from me and things like that. But ultimately, the next price tier was group coaching or one-on-one coaching. So the membership gave a middle ground where somebody could say, I'm ready to invest something, maybe not that much, or as much. And so it helped round out sort of all of these income streams to really help people wherever they were and whatever their commitment level was. So it's been an interesting process as I've added each of these things.
So on that point, I'm curious how you think about that funnel of moving somebody that's essentially somebody that just heard an episode once, they're a casual listener, all the way down to somebody that becomes, a member, a supporter, somebody that buys your merch. How do you think about that funnel?
That is a function of showing up consistently and building that trust. So I've had some people tell me, they became a member on the first episode that they listened to. And I talk about what the members get, they get one of the things they get is a different recipe every week. So in the episode, at the beginning of the episode, I am telling the membership what recipe they're getting that week. So other people hear it, maybe who aren't members, but go, I want that recipe. How do I get it? So that constant reminder of what the membership is, what they get, and then continuing to show up and demonstrate that this is who I am and this is what I do, and you can count on me delivering what I tell you I am going to deliver. And I think that's what brings people step by step through that funnel. And with that said, some people go from listener to client. Some people go, from listener to member to customer to client. It's not, sometimes it's every step, sometimes it's not.
Right, yeah.
But the options are there. And a big piece of that shift is also getting someone onto my email list and staying connected with them in those other ways also.
Yeah, those email lists are pretty powerful still, given how old that technology is.
And I will admit, I am so resistant to email marketing because, so I started in marketing in the very early 2000s. So like the early days of pay-per-click and pay-per-impression and email marketing. And when it sort of felt like it completely blew up, and I was like, I loathe receiving them. I don't want to contribute to that email nuisance. Over the years, I have come around more and more to the power of it, especially as social media has become almost more annoying for some people. And the ads it's sort of, there's always that ebb and flow. But the piece that I've really learned to value about email marketing is that it's the only list I own.
That's right.
That if something happens to the podcast platforms, if something I don't know, no podcaster knows every single person who's ever listened to their show because the platforms don't share that. I mean, data privacy is only one of the reasons, right? Even on social media, we have names, but there's a lot more people that, across all the social platforms, I think I'm over 18,000 people in reach. My email list is not over 18,000, not even close. But if something happens to those platforms, I lose all of those connections. So the more we can, for all of us, and if you're listening and you're a podcast fan and listener, just subscribe to those emails because, again, if all those platforms went away and you appreciate this relationship or that content, there's only one way to still get it.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I've made this point a lot in my career. I have a background in marketing as well, and for years I've been saying, all those other platforms, they're basically rented, right? You're renting your presence on there. The algorithm can decide to make your stuff invisible, at the snap of a finger. The platform can go bankrupt. The platform can ban you for no particularly good reason. An email list you own. So you own that direct relationship with somebody that is essentially giving you permission to market to them, to promote your things to them. I've also noticed some podcasters are now starting to collect phone numbers to send SMS and text messages.
So I do text marketing with my ads, actually.
Cool.
So maybe another hack for people, because you know how like you have to remember some long URL if you're going to, or remember to go chase and find the link in the show notes and whatever. So I do a text call to action for people to text one word to a number. We're used to remembering phone numbers and one word, and we can do that while we're listening. And then it texts them the link to that sponsor or partner or whatever.
Yeah. I like it. Yeah, that's smart. I've also noticed the show has garnered some of its awards. I think you got Earworthy's Independent Podcast Award, and there was, I believe, an International Women's Podcast Award as well. Congrats, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm wondering how those recognitions, if they made any difference for your podcast, if they helped to grow it at all.
It's an interesting thing because a lot of the awards, the big awards, right? Like Earworthy, I think, is an industry, known entity.
Yeah.
Shout out to Frank. I think, International Women's Podcast Awards, maybe in the middle. And then you end up with like the Webbies, and a lot of the awards are very much this money grab, pay to play kind of scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because a lot of those have more recognition, but they basically cater to those who have the budgets to more or less throw away on submitting to all of these awards. And so what I appreciate most about the awards that I've participated in and won some is that they are very accessible and or 100% selected and, by that committee, that it wasn't even a submission process. And so those, for me personally, hold more value than some of the ones that maybe people have heard of. For me, they're more about reinforcing and validating what I'm doing and my approach, because I think a lot of times I am pretty different than the typical podcaster who's like, great, any advertiser, you want to put money here? Sure, whatever it is. Or let me just get the biggest name guest I can to spend an hour with me or whatever it is. So it very much validates. And then in sharing those accolades, I think it helps turn people onto the show who maybe haven't listened yet, but they know me, or are curious but aren't sure if it's worth their time. And so a lot of that then is on me to share those things. And then certainly, as we talked about guesting and some of these other things, it definitely helps create a reputation and information about me that I think maybe opens some doors at times, certainly not on their own, but in conjunction with everything else.
Okay. As you probably know, a lot of podcasters can obsess over various metrics when it comes to their podcasts, things like download numbers. When you look at your own numbers, whether it's downloads, memberships, conversions, client leads, what are the metrics you actually pay attention to, and what are the ones that you wind up ignoring?
All of them fall into every category. It kind of depends on, it kind of depends on the day or the week. The download numbers are interesting, but I'm looking more at the changes and saying, well, what can I attribute those changes to? Are there certain topics that people are particularly interested in? Was there a guest that really helped promote an episode? Or did I do something in promoting that episode that was different than what I've done with other ones? So I look at some of those. I think the conversion rates I'm always curious about and experimenting with. I don't know that I have figured out, the magic formula. I think there's other people who have probably figured that out better than I have. But the ones that make the biggest difference are the completion rates.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times when podcasters look at the completion rates, they look at that percentage and say, okay, I like to dial into that and say, in this episode, where did I lose people? And I have essentially with those, throughout the episode, you want it to be as flat as possible, right? You're naturally going to have some taper off, but you want it to be as flat as possible. And there are some times where I impress myself with, that completion rate and where I'm losing people or how many people actually get to the end of that episode. And interesting, going back to what we were talking about in the different episode formats with the Nutrition Nugget, when I first launched those, they aired it was a segment at the end of the full-length episode that was also pulled out and published separately.
Cool.
And then I noticed that with that completion rate that people weren't even really getting to it. But seeing that total episode length at an hour or an hour and 10, or maybe more, because it had this chunk at the end that was a separate thing, I ended up deciding to completely pull it out. So I preview it in the full-length episode for that week's Nutrition Nugget bonus episode. But now it only airs separately. And that also helped because people saw, okay, well, I can wrap my head around 40 minutes or 50 minutes or whatever, that episode length was, without that, which was interesting.
The wellness space that you're in, I'm assuming, just from what I've seen, is extremely saturated.
Yes.
What does someone have to do? Let's say I'm a new podcaster. I have an interest in that space. Maybe I'm a wellness coach like yourself. What does somebody have to do? Maybe not just say, but sort of structurally set up to kind of break through all of that noise. Or is this market too saturated? Is it too crowded for new voices to get traction without some sort of pre-existing audience that they port from, whether it's an email list or social media that they port over to their new podcast?
So I don't think it's too crowded for anybody. I do think it requires some, I guess, maybe personal reflection and strategy at the jump of what's your goal with this show. Because some people want to do it because they want to have the conversations and it doesn't really matter to them who's listening. And if you're doing it for yourself, then have at it. Do whatever you want,
Sure.
If your objective is to come into the space and become a voice that becomes known or bigger or competes with some of these big voices in the space, then there's a different strategy that says, well, what's my angle? What's my niche? Who am I talking to? What am I sharing? How am I sharing it that's going to be different than what they're already listening to? And I do think that part of why I say it's not completely saturated and that there's room is because people listen to more than one podcast in a category all the time. And so it becomes a question of who is that audience and how are you going to earn their ear and their time? Because that's the most valuable thing. That's, the intimacy. So I think it's most on the strategy piece than anything.
Interesting. So I want to touch on a few questions just about how you feel about kind of podcasting's place in society in general. And particularly in your space, I feel like misinformation travels, faster than ever, really.
Indeed.
But you've built sort of an entire show that's dedicated to correcting some of that misinformation. And I guess in sort of a strange way, that means that bad information is part of what makes your show necessary in the first place. So
True.
The question I have is, how do you feel about podcasts in general as they relate to kind of public health literacy? Are they a net positive or not?
It's a great question. I do think they're a net positive. For the mission behind everything I do is to change the state of healthcare and empower people to reclaim their own health. And if I were to look at the net outcome of podcasts in this category, I think it's a net positive and people recognizing that it's up to them, not their doctor, not the government, to ensure their health and longevity or whatever their goals are. And so while it now requires some discernment, I think on the whole, creating conversation has rarely led us down the wrong path. I think if we end up in an echo chamber, we're more likely to end up in a dangerous place.
All right. Yeah. And I feel also seems to me there's a bit of a tension between kind of speed and accuracy when it comes to the health space, because it feels to me like there's some new trend every week. Whether it's Ozempic, seed oils, raw milk, whatever it is, it winds up exploding on social media or, like you said, in certain echo chambers. But you've also now built up an audience that presumably wants your take on some of these topics, right? So how do you balance that, sort of making sure that you're covering a topic that maybe there isn't a huge amount of information on it available yet, and yet your audience is kind of going, what do you think of this, Jen?
Yeah. So I think that's the piece of long form versus short form that can kind of be at odds. Short form being social media, long form being a podcast, even whether that's 15 minutes or, an hour, 2 hours, like some shows. So for me, I am very upfront with people to say, we don't know yet. From what I know so far, here's my take. And so maybe that then becomes a 15-minute nutrition nugget rather than a full 40, 50-minute episode. Over time, like speaking of Ozempic, I first started talking about it in a nutrition nugget in can't remember if it was 2021 or 2022. So
that's early.
Very early. Like too early. So then when people started talking about it, I was like, I was talking about this like a year ago, right?
Right.
But it started as a nutrition nugget. And then as people started to talk more about it, as we started to have more data on and public information about people who were taking it, and I had clients who were considering it or taking it and what their experiences were, and working with health professionals, with their patients before, during, after, those kinds of things. I've done multiple episodes. So now there's a handful that talk about these medications in various capacities. And so I think there's a value in long form to explore nuance, to say, here are the things to consider. Here's what leads me to this conclusion. These are the questions that I still have about it. And there's also, I think, some of the beauty of this space and the beauty of science and research is that we're continuing to learn. And I guess maybe that even goes back to another question that you asked of if the person you're listening to has never changed their mind on anything, or has never continued to learn or explore or read more or get more information because research is evolving, we're continuing to learn more and more, and say, hey, we know this now that I didn't know when I recorded this thing 6 years. So my first episode was the truth about alcohol. Well, I also just did an episode that was an interview about alcohol with something that I didn't even know when I recorded that first episode, which is that alcohol is a category 1 or group 1 carcinogen. in the same category as asbestos and cigarettes and all these other things that we actively avoid.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody ever talks about alcohol being in that category.
Yeah.
So I just think that there's a piece of continuing to explore and learn more and have those conversations that a podcast allows as a medium in a way that some other mediums don't. And I think there's something special about that.
Mm-hmm. Given that sort of parasocial intimacy that a lot of listeners wind up developing with podcast hosts, I mean, I know I do. Is there sort of a line there in your space where you kind of have to think about, the difference between being sort of a trusted voice in your space versus sort of, I don't know, becoming somebody's de facto doctor or physician?
Yes, always. I am often reminding people, especially when I talk about supplements, go back to your pharmacist, go back to your physician. There's the disclaimer in my show description that nothing we talk about is medical advice, nothing is FDA approved, and we are not here to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent any disease. And sometimes I say that in an episode.
Yeah.
I think we have a responsibility to remind people of that because of that intimacy, because of that trust. And it's also why I also encourage people to reach out. That we're speaking in generalities. Like I can say, okay, somebody in this scenario may want to look at these things, and you might fall into that category. It also doesn't mean that there are other things that we completely ignore. And so I'm often reiterating to people to work with a trusted advisor, to think about a care team, to go back to their physicians. And also, if your physician is not open to these conversations or to answering your questions, it's okay to go find a new physician.
That's right.
And so I think it's having those conversations and certainly reminding people of that is part of our responsibility as the communicator of the information.
If podcasting disappeared tomorrow and you had to find another format or medium to sort of carry your mission forward, what do you think it would be? And what do you think that says about podcasting and what podcasting can do that maybe other media formats can't?
I think, so I wrote a book that came out last fall. So part of me wants to say writing would be the other medium. But I don't know. I'm one of those people where, like a lot of entrepreneurs, we own like 20 URLs, right? I've owned Health Coach with a Food Blog for 20 years. And I never did anything with it. So I even hesitate to say that I would turn to writing because clearly talking is my medium. So I don't know, maybe that ends up meaning finding a radio show. Like, do we go back to the old radio model so that talking is the medium? Does it become, a lot more audiobooks, or then relying on social media for that auditory or visual content rather than reading?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but I do think that podcasting is in a slightly precarious place because on the one hand, the barrier to part of what podcasting was known for always is this low barrier to entry.
Right, yeah.
And it creates a place and a space for so many voices.
Mm-hmm.
And also what I see happening on the industry side is what we've seen happen in so many industries and in media over time, that the money tends to go to the same handful, that
That's right.
It's a top 0.2, 0.5% that maybe can survive and end up with that longevity. And so I also believe that as more and more that money starts to drive what's happening in this industry, like, knock on wood, but it's only a matter of time before FTC and other regulations that other media platforms are subject to end up in this space. And it fundamentally changes that low barrier to entry or that place for people to share a voice.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I also think part of that, you're right about there being a low barrier to entry in terms of actual production, right? Anybody with an iPhone can essentially start a podcast these days. But I think part of the barrier that we're now seeing more and more as the number of podcasts grows, as podcasts get professionalized, as you said, there's more money coming into the space. It's harder and harder for, again, somebody that doesn't have an audience to port from somewhere else to stand out, to even have anybody listen to their shows. So I think that barrier to entry, while the entry on the sort of technical side has gone down, the barrier to entry on distribution marketing has gone up.
1,000%. I mean, podcasting's always had this discovery problem, and solving that is the next multi-billion dollar idea that, everybody is working on in some level,
Me too.
Right, exactly.
Okay, final 2 questions. First, What are 3 podcasts that you'd recommend?
Okay. So, at the risk of now recommending some of those top podcasts that are so popular,
how dare you?
Right, exactly. I have a girl crush on Kara Swisher. So her shows right now, Pivot with Scott Galloway, I listen to.
Good.
Right, and On with Kara Swisher, I love. I'm a big fan of Esther Perel, so I listen to all of her shows. Because, first of all, I think to be a fly on the wall in someone's therapy is so entertaining. Amazing show. Yeah. And then there's so many over the years that are almost like a mini series and those kinds of things. And again, to be sort of stereotypical, true crime, it just gets you. But the Long Island serial killer was one, if you haven't listened to it. I actually met this man once.
Wow.
I'm in New York. I met him at a networking thing once. I mean, he was a little creepy, but yeah, so great podcast.
Wild.
Totally wild. But so, like, I love some of those mini series, but there was one called Edith that was great. Now I'm giving you a bunch, but yes.
No, it's good.
Yeah.
And where can people find you online?
Absolutely. All social media, I am at Jenn Trepeck, JENNTREPECK. My website is asaladwithasideofries.com. I have a gift there for everybody. So that gets you in my email ecosystem, as we talked about. I do not spam you, like we also talked about. But that would be awesome. So asaladwithasideofries.com.
Perfect. Jenn, it's been fantastic to speak with you today. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, likewise. Thank you so much.
Of course. All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod. And if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.